that kind introduction. My name is Mikaela Hinds, as it says on the board. But I'm the carbon market analyst and Caribbean lead at Apala Group, and I'm actually based in Barbados. At Apala Group, we specialize in corporate sustainability, in helping and designing high-impact projects to accelerate decarbonization across the Asia-Pacific and Latin America. But recently, we've ventured into the Caribbean, where we're supporting Close the Loop Caribbean, as you guys were introduced to earlier, in their carbon project development process. So today, I'll be sharing some insights on that process. So we at Apala Group consider this work especially significant and meaningful because there's a notable absence of such projects in the region. And so this initiative with Close the Loop is likely to set a precedent in Trinidad and pave the way for more projects to come in the future. To put this matter into perspective, currently there are over 20,000 projects globally, issuing more than 3 billion carbon credits in total. Of these 20,000, less than 100 are in the Caribbean region, none in the Eastern Caribbean, and only around 15% of them have been successfully issued credits. And now, why is this the case, you might ask? Today, I hope to provide you with an answer to that question. Just by a quick show of hands, who's familiar with carbon projects, carbon credits, the whole hullabaloo? Okay, so this might be helpful to some of you, and it'll be a refresher to others. So let's quickly review some fundamentals of how the system works. A carbon project, carbon project development, of course, first starts with a carbon project. And this is an activity that reduces or removes or avoids greenhouse gas emissions. And it can look very different. It could be something in forestry or waste management or even energy efficiency. But ultimately, the impact of these projects are measured in carbon credits. Now, these are tradable certificates, each representing 1 ton of carbon dioxide or its equivalent in greenhouse gases removed from the atmosphere. And like commodities, carbon credits are traded in markets. It could be either in a compliance market, which is driven by legally mandated participation, or the voluntary market, where participants go beyond any legal requirement and are motivated by factors like corporate social responsibility, personal climate goals, brand image, consumer demand, of the like. So a prime example of the system at work is Guyana, who in recent years has generated over 30 million credits by preserving their forests and selling them to buyers like airlines who are subjected to mandatory emissions reduction schemes, but also to voluntary participants like Hess Corporation, which is one of the oil companies that's drilling in the country. It's important to emphasize that these mechanisms aren't just for large international corporations like the Microsofts and the Googles of the world. Local organizations and individuals can participate. And I'm not sure if everyone's been made aware of this, but if you aren't, then you are now. IAMovement will be purchasing carbon credits to offset the emissions associated with this conference, which I think really emphasizes just how local these efforts can get. So the benefits of carbon projects are a result of a long and often tedious process. In fact, the average timeline for the development process is around 2 to 5 years. And this really depends, varying on the complexity of the project activities and how far along they might be. But generally, the process is split into 4 stages. It starts with project initiation. So in this stage, developers conceptualize and implement activities, and there's usually some sort of ongoing process of monitoring or documentation to measure or track the project's impact and progress. And then looking towards that carbon project status, then developers go about selecting a carbon standard and methodology that best suits their activities. And these standards set the guidelines and criteria for the certification of a project. And so the responsibilities within this next stage will lie beyond the developer mostly and with a carbon standard program. So here it's all about validation and verification. They evaluate the project design to ensure that it aligns with the best practices for emissions reduction, and they engage in some on-the-ground measurement and reporting to confirm the accuracy of these claimed emissions reductions. But successful completion of this stage results in the issuance of carbon credits. And once those credits are issued, they can be sold on carbon markets. Meanwhile, the project continues with its activities, ensuring that it meets its own goals and it stays within the requirements to continue to comply with the standards for future issuance of credits. And it's expected that developers will still undergo a process of MRV, which is monitoring, reporting, and verification, to ensure that the project continues to meet its goals and maintains transparency in the process. Perhaps the most significant stage in terms of complexity, and I've highlighted it a bit with a little orange dot, I'm not sure if it's big enough, but the most complex stage is usually certification, and this also happens to be the most challenging stage for Caribbean projects, and this is because of how unique these projects can be. So I want to make it clear that while I did mention the Guyana's success with their forest projects, while that is notable, it's not necessarily representative of the norm of Caribbean projects. You know, being in South America, Guyana's ecosystems differ significantly in type and scale from those of the islands. So the island context looks a lot different. You might find projects within agriculture, reforestation, mangrove restoration, you know, things that more correspond with our ecosystems. But regardless of their focus, they usually have these four characteristics in common. So the first is their size. Due to limited land space, especially in the Lesser Antilles, projects are usually on a much smaller scale than in larger countries, even micro scale. There are also some elements of our unique natural history in the design of the project. You know, we can often quickly tell a picture of the Caribbean apart from other parts of the world, even in other tropical areas. And this is because we have, you know, a mix of endemic and historically introduced species that has resulted in very diverse and distinctive ecosystems. Many projects also take on what I call a multi-benefit or holistic approach, in that they go beyond the carbon sequestration aspect to address local issues like soil degradation, biodiversity loss, and coastal erosion, providing broader environmental and social benefits. And then finally, due to limited internal funding, you'll find that many projects are actually initiated with the support of international funding from agencies like the IDB and USAID, which I find is quite a pleasant characteristic to have. But while these factors do make for interesting projects, they can become obstacles in certification. So this is generally due to the lack of local applicability in some of the standards, eligibility criteria, or requirements, and how this manifests throughout the process. So many standards impose minimum requirements on project size or emissions reductions, which disqualifies many Caribbean projects just off the bat. This might also be less common, but I've seen some that also place restrictions on species used in agriculture initiatives, favoring globally recognized and usually more large-scale crops like wheat or corn, and less locally recognized ones. And despite that lovely support from external funding or international agencies, financing still poses a challenge. The truth is that beyond that external funding, some may still find themselves lacking in the certification process. So while some standards scale their fees with project size, which can create a pathway for smaller projects, the cost of a third-party audit, which confirms the validation and verification procedures in this stage, is usually fixed. And you know, this, depending on the standard, it might be impossible to shield small projects from these types of fees. So some standards have sought to combat this challenge by providing additional support for third-party audits, but this can come with further restrictions in project requirements, which results in developers not being able to capture the full potential and in turn the full or true financial value of that project. So still, even if a project reaches certification, the unfortunate reality is that the financial returns from selling the credits likely is insufficient to sustain the project in the long run, rendering it financially infeasible. Overall, there's a possibility that a project might face just one of these challenges, but usually it's a combination of many of them, forcing a choice between compromise and preserving project value. So regrettably, this is the reality, and we've already seen some of these challenges manifest in our current work in Trinidad with Close the Loop. Since late last year, we've been working with a team on 3 projects, one in quarry rehabilitation and reforestation, another in waste diversion and composting, and then the final in the conservation of the Northern Range. And we're on a journey of assessing these 3 projects against standards to see which one fits the best, and evaluating funding approaches to ensure the long-term sustainability of these projects after they've been issued credits. But specifically in assessing the quarry reforestation project, the process has been quite complex. Activities for this particular project span 200 acres, but they still failed to meet the minimum size requirements of many standards out there. And they classified only as a micro-scale project for those that it did manage to qualify for. Furthermore, the project is dispersed across many non-contiguous sites, which have either required a bundling of these sites into one project program, which is a luxury that can come at a luxury price, or the registration of each site as an individual separate project, which potentially further increases price or efforts going into the process. And so this dilemma between compromise and retaining value continues. A core element within the project's process of rehabilitating these degraded quarry lands is soil restoration, which has the potential to enhance carbon sequestration in the form of soil organic carbon, as our speaker from Mantle Labs would have mentioned earlier. For these reasons and more, it's a very valuable part of the process, but we've encountered some trouble in ensuring its inclusion, as the more cost-favorable standards for a project this size often don't include soil organic carbon in their quantification, and those that do, which are the more established and usually more expensive standards, they do it, but at an additional cost. So another significant matter as it relates to Trinidad is the law requiring quarries to rehabilitate their lands after use, although this is not exactly enforced. And I fear this seems to be a common trend around the Caribbean as well. But still, despite this lack of enforcement, the law directly conflicts with a fundamental requirement within carbon standards that's called regulatory additionality, which stipulates that the project activities must not be legally mandated. And so there's been a question of how we can effectively demonstrate this lack of enforcement so that we don't infringe on this requirement in the process. These are just a few of the scenarios that we've encountered just in assessing eligibility, which is basically the beginning of the process. But I think it really shows how intricate it can get, really just putting Caribbean projects through the ringer. In closing, despite all these challenges, I think it's still important to point out that carbon standards have been working towards becoming more inclusive. There's new specialized programs for small projects, and there's existing standards who are reconfiguring their rules to suit. However, faced with such inherent hurdles, it's become clear that capturing the true value of Caribbean projects requires a more locally grounded approach. Carbon markets hold immense potential for the region. They're a direct path to that dual benefit of environmental protection and economic gain that sustainable development aims to achieve. And in line with our mission of driving climate impact forward, we at Apala Group are eager to collaborate in the space and help projects in the region realize their full potential. So with that being said, I just want to thank you for listening so attentively to my presentation today. In case you'd like to chat more or reach out to Apala Group, you can reach us or me at these profiles here, or you can approach me afterwards. Thank you so much.